Nice to see you guys here. We're 5 minutes ahead of time, but we will have our speakers with us shortly. We've got Eric, so that's great. And Lynn, feel free to, hi, Marjorie. Lynn, feel free to make Eric a co-host and the other three when they arrive.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks. Lynn's one of my PhD students here. She's been working on shared autonomous all-electric vehicles, whereas Kaya Lee has been working on safety. So I'll be presenting some of Kaya's work here and introducing the rest of the group. If anybody has any thoughts or wants to unmute, just let us know in the chat box. Maybe tell us where you are in the world. Lynn and I are both here in this office building at UT Austin, I think.
I'm in the DC area, like Eric is, but I'll be off camera.
Yeah, I'm also in the DC area in Arlington specifically.
Yes, Eric, I've been to HLDIIHS offices. So
The new one or the old one?
old, I think 18 years ago, maybe.
Oh, okay, you gotta come check out the new one. We moved right before the pandemic and yeah, did a lot of nice cool design in the office and all that.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think so I'll be on sabbatical at MIT for this fall semester, so I'll get to see a lot of the Northeast. I don't know that I'll have much time. By the time we get to DC area, it'll probably be early December, but if you and Jessica Cicchino are around, it'd be great to meet you in person.
Yeah, let us know.
And thanks to Sarang for joining us from Sweden. We have a former student here at UT who I guess is in Denmark, so Copenhagen. I'm not sure what city Chalmers is in. Is there a city called Chalmers, Sarang? Ah, Gothenburg. I don't know what Goten means, but Berg means city, guys, as far as I know. My husband speaks German, so I'm lucky. I'm the Spanish speaker in the household. Ben, great. I will be living between Somerville, or on the edge of Somerville, right between MIT and Tufts University, where my daughter is going into her senior year. So that's why we're going out there, is to make sure she can be close to our beloved dog for a year.
Oh, nice. I'm about an hour north of the city, so a little bit further than that. But yeah, spent a lot of time here in the area.
Yeah, well, I'll be at UMass Amherst speaking, and Vermont and Yukon and Princeton, Columbia, which are all south. So I'll be leaving the area a fair bit. Who are you? You're at Simulytic. Okay. AV Intelligence for Insurance. Wow. Okay. Hopefully you and Eric are familiar with one another.
Eric May, I've seen your name before, but I don't know that we've had a chance to meet. Yeah, I come from the insurance industry myself, so I was in the industry for about a decade, and now been part of a couple insurtech companies working with them on the AV space.
Oh, cool. Okay, yeah, nice to meet you, Ben.
Yeah, you guys feel free to put some papers or reports that relate, or maybe your favorite paper. It doesn't have to relate to autonomous vehicles or autonomous driving systems. Feel free to throw those into the chat box for us. I always find that really interesting. Same with Jahed and Marjorie and Sarang. I'm going to text my friend Chris Cusano, see what he's up to. He should be here with us. And I think Missy's going to be late, I'm afraid, but we have Carol's recording because she's in an NCHRP. Oh, here's Chris. Okay, he just came into the Zoom room, so you can make him a co-host for me. Thank you. So Chris, Ben Lewis works at Simulytic, and he's in Boston area, about an hour north of Boston in the AV and risk intelligence for insurance. So highly related. Marjorie, I'm not sure what you do. Sarang is at Chalmers in Gothenburg, Sweden. And Jahed is in Nova Scotia, I believe.
I'm a science and technology policy person, and over the last few years, I've been working on automated vehicles off and on. That's how I met Eric, and I think I met Missy originally because of broader artificial intelligence issues, and then have intersected on these issues.
And I see just by her rather unique name, Marjorie is at Rand. So welcome.
Yes, thank you. Some of the time and some of the time elsewhere.
Got it. Got it.
Yeah, hi, Kara. Yeah, it's Nova Scotia in Canada, all the way East Canada. Yeah. So
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to make it up that far, but I hope you have a beautiful, brilliant fall, and feel free to
that's
come
wonderful.
down to
Yeah.
Boston.
Yeah, in Canada, Nova Scotia is famous for weather, for sure. Yeah.
Is it easy for you to get to Vermont, Jahed?
Sorry?
Is it easy for you to get to Vermont?
Yeah, that's easy. This is close by. Maine is close by, and Boston too. Easy access to those.
Yeah, well, I'll make it all the way up to the University of Vermont for a seminar.
Okay.
So that's as close
Yeah.
as I'm going to get, I
Probably
think.
I'll just have a drive there.
Okay, well, the rest of you feel free to introduce yourselves in that chat box for us. We've only got 5 speakers, so we have the luxury of some time. In the other sessions you've been seeing, there's more, typically 6 speakers. But Carol's not physically with us because she is the leading investigator on an NCHRP project for the Transportation Research Board. And so her panel chose today, right now, for her to be speaking. So she recorded her presentation. It's a little bit shorter than typical, and Lynn will be playing that when we get there. In the meantime, I probably need to find the bios that I wrote up from my colleagues here. I was moderating and leading 2 sessions this morning, so I'm a little bit behind the times here. Let me pull that up. So I've been teaching here at UT for 27 years, and Chris Cusano graduated from Virginia Tech with his PhD and his bachelor's and master's, I guess, in mechanical engineering. Somehow he did a PhD in just 3 years, which is incredible. But, I think he went straight through and he started working at the Virginia Tech Center for Injury Biomechanics on statistical models and computational models for crash avoidance while he was still a student. So that might have helped. Also playing saxophone during those years, I believe, and previously worked for Toyota in their ADAS development. So assisted driving, and now an AV safety engineer that I get to talk to every month or 2, thanks to work that I'm doing with one of my other graduate students, Kaya Lee, who I think is speaking in a different session maybe at this time. So I'm afraid she may not be with us. Eric is Director of Statistical Services at the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, which is allied with the Highway Loss Data Institute. So they're kind of a joint group that most insurance companies use here in the United States to sort of aggregate data to infer who among us is the worst driver and is going to cause the highest billing and claims against those insurers. So they're trying to get a sense of who's more crash involved and what vehicles are safer. So they do a lot of safety testing in addition to the NHTSA testing that we have at the federal level. And he's been there for about 2 decades working on, improving highway safety or roadway safety, I hope, all types of roads, not just highways, Eric. Even though I know the word highway is in your IIHS's name, I hope you're looking at local streets as well and, getting the information out to those who can implement them, not just people buying vehicles, but, policymakers, planners, designers. And he got his BS and MS degrees in math at the University of Alabama and spent a couple of years studying biostatistics at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Carol's a research professor at the University of Michigan in their Transportation Research Institute. It's called UMTRI, and she's been doing 30 years or more of crash data research for crash avoidance and recovery, and now and in recent years, including safety assessment of automated driving systems. She's got all her, well, I think she has 3 degrees in mathematical psychology, plus a master's in applied statistics. Missy Cummings will be the last formal speaker, and then we'll hopefully have some time for a more broad, free-form question and answer. We'll see how we do on timing, but her PhD is in systems engineering from the University of Virginia, and she directed the Duke University's Humans and Autonomy Laboratory after being one of the U.S. Navy's first female fighter pilots. So she joined the National Highway Traffic Safety Institute under Joe Biden in 2021 for a couple years, and now teaches at George Mason University in the robotics and mechanical engineering area. She's also a fellow of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. And I guess I've been here as a professor of transportation engineering for 27 years, but I also now hold appointments in economics and public affairs, which is pretty cool. And I interact with the business school on real estate for land use forecasting. So I mostly do data prediction and data analysis for usually policy reasons. So motivated by, just trying to make the world a better place for all species, not just our own. So I will kick it off. I don't see any questions yet in there, but I'll go ahead and share my screen with you so you can get a sense of what my slides look like. And Kaya Lee helped me update these a little bit, but I won't be able to share everything that we have because of time limitations. So I had a big Texas Department of Transportation pedestrian project a few years ago, and we're adding other vulnerable users, cyclists. We have enough data on cycling in this country to add them, but they are a much lesser mode or less common mode than walking is. And then just as we pivot to the question really of this session is, how does human driving compare to autonomous vehicle or self-driving or highly automated vehicle systems? And what are the benchmarks? And so I'll also be showing you some of Noah Goodall's slides. And Noah is on vacation today with his family, so he cannot be here, but he had some fantastic slides that he presented at the Google offices just down the street from the TRB meeting in January of 2025. So you'll see when I shift to his crash rate comparison slides later in this deck. I'm going to move this command line out of my way here. So walking isn't 10%, I'm afraid, these days. It's just about 7% of trip choice, and it's just a tiny bit of the miles that we travel. In fact, about half of the miles that Americans travel are on trips that are over 50 miles each way. So there's no way I think any one of us is going to want to walk that in one day or one trip with one destination. And so I'm afraid it really is a minor mode in a way, except that every trip involves some walking, right? You may be walking to your car door or your parking lot or your office inside a building or on an office park. Hopefully there's some walking. And of course, walking your dog. Sometimes people don't remember to share that one with us in the National Household Travel Survey, which is the NHTS. So walking is really essential. We're not in that WALL-E world, which is a famous movie where Americans just get fat and lazy and they have to leave this planet after we destroy it, basically. And they sit in sort of like wheelchairs, self-driving wheelchairs all day long, sipping on milkshakes, from what I could tell. So hopefully we'll never, ever get to that, and we will stay active. But unfortunately, we're no match for vehicles. We're maybe 200 pounds, and the vehicles are on the order of 4,000, depending on what you buy. So we're a big piece of the death. And that means that our crash rate per mile walked is huge. I can't remember right now, but it might be on the order of 100 times as risky to walk if you're afraid of dying. But most people do die inside a vehicle, colliding, on their own or with another vehicle. But pedestrians are way overrepresented. So are cyclists, and cyclists, interestingly, are a little bit safer per a mile biked. But if you talk about injury rates, cyclists are actually at much more risk of injury. And I've broken my elbow walking, and I've wiped out and hurt my wrist twice while biking. No cars involved in any of those crashes, thank goodness. So walk trips have fell quite a bit. I guess this was a period that included COVID, and the pedestrian deaths rose a bit during that same period. If you're looking at National Highway Transportation Safety Administration data, and here we're using streetlight data, which is something we were looking at in the previous session I was just listening into, to give you a sense of how we compare to our peers. We were below Spain for a little while there, but above everybody else. And now our death rate per vehicle mile traveled is about 5 times as high as it is. And in Norway, you know, we're about 10 times as bad. So our drivers are not as properly trained, and they don't really walk or bike much. So they, I guess, don't appreciate those other modes and those users in those modes as much as you might have in Norway, where there's a lot of biking, I think, in the winter with spiked wheels. And Japan, has lots of traffic, very intense interactions. One of my students was injured walking in Japan, but there's still a far cry from where we are. And if you look at pedestrian deaths, well, everybody else is trying to get those down. And I guess the United Kingdom and others are sort of stabilizing, but UK is our closest peer. Canada is down below them, as you can see in our numbers. This is just total count. This is not per mile walked, but our numbers have gone up, even though we, don't have a much bigger population than we did in 2010. So it is a sad, under this Vision Zero that we supposedly have, or many U.S. cities have anyhow. It's really, really stunning and sad for us. So a lot of us have been working on this topic pretty heavily. So we don't walk that much. Most places walk about twice as much as we do. And the Netherlands is only 45% more because they are biking way more than the average American. And, our ped deaths per capita are rising about 2% a year, while they're falling about 1% a year still in our peer nations, and probably in Canada as well, and Australia. So we've got about 15 ped deaths for every million miles walked, whereas we have about 1 crash death in any mode per every 100 million miles driven. So I guess that's more than a 100. It might be like a 1,500 to 1 ratio of how risky this mode is. But of course, we rarely walk very long distances. But yeah, 5 to 10 times higher per mile walked in this case. So there's different denominators you can use, and our numbers, unfortunately, have been going up versus like 1990, which is what that plot is for. And I'm lucky that John Pusher and Ralph Buehler have been doing careful studies for a while. They're legends in this field. So using the National Household Travel Survey and the fatal analysis and reporting survey data or sample, we can just tell you that only about 15% of Americans do any walking on a given day, as far as we can tell, and less than 1% are walking at night, and yet 3/4 of our pedestrian deaths are at night. And most deaths tend to be in the southern latitudes, even though, you would think, oh, nighttime, drivers can't see. That's why there's all these crashes. Well, guess what? We have more sun here and sunlight and daylight here in the southern latitudes, and yet we lead the nation. And I guess New Mexico, where I was born, is number 1. So it's about 4.5 pedestrian deaths for every 100,000 persons there. And I think part of that is the Native American population. They are, one of the lowest income and most vulnerable populations, living in very low density areas, often without automobile access. So we're seeing a lot of walking by that population in very dangerous, sort of poorly designed highway settings. And I guess this image here is just to show you that walking varies a lot by time of year, and it does vary a lot by latitude. So I think it's Hawaii that gets a ton of walking in May and June, but part of that is visitors. So tourist areas like Washington D.C. get a lot of pedestrians because they're coming in, and parking is expensive if you don't already have a spot. So parking at your hotel it's just best to leave that car at home and walk, and of course take the metro in DC and other cities that have good transit systems. But biking's a fantastic mode. It is the most efficient mode, and it makes people happy from surveys that people have done. Here's a map of our best estimates using the National Household Travel Survey walking distances per walk mile traveled. So instead of VMT, we've got WMT. You can do the same thing with bike miles traveled, but it's a much smaller sample. So you can see, I think there's like a 40-degree latitude line going through practically the bottom portion of all those states. So that is considered southern U.S. by our definitions, versus northern would be right above that 40-degree latitude. And I think Texas, or where I am, is at about 100 degrees longitude, in case you're wondering about lat long here. So we do have a paper about this. It is open source. So if you just write darkness and death and my last name, it'll take you right to it. It's kind of interesting, and it's very short. It's quite easy to get through. So we're getting much more acquainted with cyclists these days, and those numbers have been rising, partly because of Lance Armstrong, who is native to Austin, I guess. A fall from grace for him, by drugging himself to win those Tour de France's and probably many other feats. But amazing athlete, and I got a lot of people cycling, but I don't know. I'd have to look at the trends over time for this minor mode to get a sense of those distances and how much of that was a Lance effect. But we are seeing over, I guess 250, over 1,000 per year across the nation. And the numbers have gone up since 2005, partly because of that increasing exposure, more bike miles traveled per capita. Luckily, we do have the fatal analysis record system, which is 100% of deaths in this country. And this is 5 years of deaths, I think. So about 8,000 a year. And so it's pretty sparse, but it's definitely heavy towards those southern states. But New York obviously has a lot of population, so it also has a fair number of pedestrian and bike deaths. And of course, automobiles are very expensive to own and park in New York. North Carolina is also a dangerous place, and I heard that the North Carolina DOT is responsible for all roads in that state, and so that, I think, is part of what makes that state unusually dangerous, is that the state isn't in charge of all of the roads, and that's just too much of a responsibility for a state to have. So they are not very focused on these more active modes. Okay, so just to give you a sense by time of day, as I mentioned earlier, 3/4 of those pedestrian deaths at night, but you also see the cyclist deaths rising. Even though most people don't bike at night, they know how dangerous it is. If you're going, it's very hard to see unless you have a really good bike light. One of the scariest things I've ever done when I was like 19 years old or something was try to bike home from Stanford University, because I grew up in Palo Alto, back to my house, and I could not see far enough to bike. So it was like biking blind. So I can never recommend that. I think one of the best things we can do for cyclists is to hand out cheap little lights for them to put on their bike. And, if somebody steals it, just you have another one, keep it on your backpack, and keep it flashing even during the daytime. Same thing for motorcyclists. And pedestrians, I carry a light when I walk my dog at night, and it just goes on as soon as I hear anybody or anything near me, so they know where I am. And yeah, it's that overnight period is also really dangerous. When people are supposed to be asleep, almost nobody is biking or walking, but a lot of people are getting into cars, and they're walking to their car, maybe in a bar area on a Saturday or Sunday night. That is a very common death situation for the pedestrians. I'm not sure about the cyclists. And we are, able to look at that data. Sequoia has been looking at it, just so you have a sense. Pedestrians die much more often per mile traveled, and of course as a percentage of the population, because they are a big mode compared to biking. And like I said earlier, the late Fridays and Saturday nights, which might be Saturday morning and Sunday morning, especially males and in urban areas, but it may just be that they're walking to their car intoxicated, and maybe not driving, but they're getting into a passenger side, and they're being exposed to roadways at those times. And then, intersections are your safest bets. So a lot of people try to jaywalk to catch a bus or something, and they're getting hit and often killed. Because Waymo operates in these 4 areas, and now I guess Atlanta as well, and soon Miami, and maybe Dallas. I think Boston TNC drivers or taxi drivers protested, so they're not coming to Boston this year, but they are still expanding. So we've been looking specifically at the crash data sets that those states maintain. It's not a national data set, but the national sample is too small. And so here we can capture all kinds of crash reports, and we have some pretty strong clusters in 2 of these regions, along high traffic areas and interstate highways, where you may have a lot of homeless population, or temporarily unhoused people that are walking along high-speed vehicles, and those drivers are not expecting those kinds of populations. So for a while here in Austin, 50% of our pedestrian deaths were unhoused people. And now that's down, thank goodness. The DOT created a site for people to live, and purposely moved them out during COVID, towards the end of COVID, out of that, and provided a free site to live with some basic facilities, bathrooms and that kind of thing, which has helped a great deal. So I think that percentage is down to about 20% now. It's a lot of data, just to give you a sense. I mean, it's a massive shapefile for Texas. So to go in and look at this is very difficult, but we have my previous project, and now Kaya is doing this to come up with new statistics that are very specific to those geofenced areas where we have some comparison with the autonomous vehicle data. And just to give you a taste of this, schools in all data sets that I've analyzed tend to have a lot more crashes, everything else constant, even when we estimate and control for the walk miles traveled in those zones. So it's not just an exposure issue. And then transit stops, almost doubling the amount of crashes if you increase the number of transit stops per acre in that zone, and about a 50% increase in deaths, because I guess a lot of transit users step into this street maybe trying to get between buses, or trying to cross maybe away from the intersection. So that's been very unfortunate. And we also have crash severity models, so not just frequencies, but light duty trucks being represented there. I think light duty trucks are actually much more dangerous than this 13.9% number, because they tend to go a lot slower than the sedans. And so that really saves them from being, basically a very, very, like an automatic weapon. So all vehicles, I think, when they're on, are loaded weapons in our hands, and we really need to take them much more seriously in this nation. So a lot of hit and run cases. I was sad to read that. That's about 20% of those cases. So a lot of bicyclists are now putting cameras on their bikes. So when there's a strong acceleration felt, they will record. And many people have dash cams in their cars, of course, to record, and that helps a bit with the hit and run cases, thank goodness. So NOAA is a crash and autonomous vehicle expert, and as Chris and Eric will tell you, and Carol and probably Missy, fatal crashes are quite rare, even though it is a big killer of young people. I think guns now outnumber cars as the greatest risk to our youth these days, which is horrific. And yeah, so they're both loaded weapons, I guess. But there's a lot more unreported crashes, and they're a little bit messier, but the Naturalistic Driving Survey, which is about 10 years old now, was a great way to get a sense of those kinds of crashes. And so a lot of the crashes per mile, to bring in those unreported crashes and unrecorded crashes, so maybe minor crashes that don't even meet the $1,000 threshold or whatever the police require in that state, are in some of these crash rates per 1 million miles. And These come from all sorts of people at Virginia Tech and elsewhere, maybe IHS, and these are some other numbers. So they're all over the place, these crash rates, depending on what data set you're using, what you're focusing on, and so Chris and Eric can tell you more about that. What I thought was really interesting from Noah's slides is that if you look at model driving, it's quite a bit better, about a third fewer crashes. So a 1.0 here as the base case versus like somebody, just the average sober or arrested driver and all driving, those are all pretty similar. So you really need to pay attention. And those of us who have children in the back tend to be twice as safe as those others. So the NDS data come from these 6 locations, I guess, and they are 10 years old now, so they don't have all of the bells and whistles and cell phones that we now have in our cars. But on average, we're not that great, and you really want somebody who is kind of focused and trying to be a model driver. All of these things as a benchmark for all of us, including our children who often drive our vehicles. And so Noah suggests, looking at buses as a potential point of comparison, because those drivers are paid drivers. I think Chris Cusano at Waymo has used other TNC drivers as a point of comparison, and the Waymo fleet is still beating them, maybe by a factor of 2 to 1, which is pretty impressive. So, and here, what's neat here is we also have some of the bicyclists and, pedestrians and other modes, including elevators and escalators, where you can get hurt, just being alive is, a possibility. And so he suggested looking at buses, and, just let me know if you need these slides. I'm happy to share them. Just email me directly for that. So I'm going to turn it over now to my friend Chris. Sorry if I took longer than expected here. We stopped sharing. And Chris, I think you have access.
Yeah, sure. Let me just pull up my slides. Okay, can you see that now?
Yes, it looks great.
Okay, great. All right, good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everybody. Thank you for inviting me, Cara, to speak. My name is Chris Cusano. I'm a safety researcher at Waymo. And today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about retrospective safety impact for autonomous vehicles, a little bit about best practices and some of the early results. This is kind of a view of a new technology over time and how you can evaluate its safety impact. So starting at the left-hand side of the graphic, this is before technology is widely deployed. This is where it's still under development, it's still an idea. You need to rely on prospective analyses, which means using simulation or other projections to predict what will happen once this technology is deployed. As time goes on and you start to deploy the technology on public roads, you can start to look back retrospectively, how did it perform compared to the status quo? And so my business is in autonomous ride hailing right now. That's what Waymo's product is. And we are now kind of in the crossover region. We're starting to deploy in meaningful numbers of miles in a few cities in the US. And so it's giving us, for the first time, an opportunity to not make projections, but actually look and see what happened. So the fancy name for this is retrospective safety impact. That's a term that we've come up with, but it's really a deceivingly simple science, right? It's really just 4 numbers. It's the number of crashes over some sort of exposure, usually miles driven. And in this case, you would do it for autonomous vehicles and also for some human benchmark. And so that seems super simple and really easy. And so, like, why do you need a team of PhDs to do this? It's because the data is really messy. It's hard to do these comparisons because of limitations in the data. And today I'll go into more depth on a bunch of the potential pitfalls and what we can do about them. But maybe if you just, short on attention today and you don't want to pay attention to the rest of my talk, maybe the most important thing is this first one, which is reporting threshold. What counts as a crash? So different types of crashes are in different types of databases. And if you just take one database of AVs compared to another database of humans, you might not be doing a valid comparison. So my talk today, I'll talk a little bit about best practices in this AV safety impact space. I'll go deep into what data is available. So what not only the ones we ended up selecting, but like what other ones did we consider and why do we think they're not as good? And then I'll wrap up with some of Waymos safety impact results. All right, so first on best practices. I'm sorry, Eric is going to speak right after me. I took a peek at his slides. He's going to talk about the same activity which he was a part of. So sorry for stealing your thunder, Eric. But we got together, myself and a group of other experts in this sort of vehicle safety impact research, and we got together to try to put down on paper what are the best practices you should follow when you're doing these sort of retrospective safety impact studies. You can see we tried to go kind of broad representation of insurance companies and research institutes, academia, and some industry people to get a lot of perspectives. And what we came up with was a paper that we wrote, and because you need a cool acronym to get people's attention, we came up with RAVE, which stands for Retrospective Automated Vehicle Evaluation Checklist, RAVE checklist. And this has three main overarching principles or topics that talk about the quality and validity of the comparisons you're doing, what types of transparency measures you should take when you're reporting your studies, and then how to interpret the studies. There's 15 main topic areas, and then each one of those have a couple of sub requirements with a total of 43. You can read the papers online now on traffic injury prevention. And that work was pretty successful. A lot of people liked it. And so we have started work on an ISO technical specification. Some of the authors of this RAVE checklist paper, and then some other folks in the international community are getting together. And so work has just begun on this. These things take time. So hopefully in like a year or two, we'll have a standard that can just be audited or applied that says you're following the best practices. So what data is available? This is the most important piece of the puzzle, is how do you align or match the AV data to human data? So our basic research objective here is to compare driver level or vehicle level crash rates. So this is crash involved drivers per million miles traveled between human benchmarks and automated driving systems, or ADSs, also known as AVs. We have a couple of primary goals or kind of principles based on the RAVE checklist that we want to try to follow when we're looking at data sources. One is ideally they'd be publicly accessible and reproducible, right? So it's not some proprietary data set that only a company can hold, and therefore it's hard to reproduce or compare between companies. It should follow the best practices about aligning the benchmark and the ADS data sources for a true apples to apples comparison. And the outcomes are also important. So what type of crash are you looking at? Are you looking at all crashes, including just property damage? Are you looking at injury relevant, airbags, serious injuries? And I'll go into more details on each one of these in the following slides. So on the ADS data side, the most comprehensive data source that we have available today is NHTSA's Standing General Order, or SGO. This is an order from NHTSA that requires all ADS operators like Waymo to report all crashes involving any property damage, injury, or fatality. The SGO does not require exposure reporting, so miles driven. And so we have to rely on self-reporting from the companies at this point. There's other data sources for ADS that are less complete. So California DMV is maybe the best example. Now that we have AVs that are outside of California, this one's less appealing just because it only exists in this one state. Most of the SGO crashes are very minor because they require reporting any amount of property damage. So any amount of contact. These vehicles are heavily instrumented. They have cameras all around them, LiDAR in many cases. And so it's highly likely that we know that we've been in a crash. And most of these are minor. So this chart here on the left shows the percentage of Waymos rider only. This is the fully autonomous driving mode. SGO reported crashes with a delta V less than 1 mile per hour. And you can see, depending on the area and overall, it's like just under half, like between 40 and 50% of crashes have a delta V of less than 1 mile per hour. Delta V is like change in velocity during the crash. It's a widely used severity estimation for risk of injury for the occupants inside the vehicle. And a delta V of 1 mile per hour is extremely minor. So this is like almost forces that are less than just normal driving, braking, accelerating. Oftentimes it's just rocking on the suspension or like scratches on the outside of the vehicle. And just to give you a comparison for what a typical human crash data source is, there's a NHTSA crash database called CIS, which is police reported tow-away crashes, where they do reconstructions to get delta V. And the average rear end crash of any severity in this database is 13 miles per hour. And if you restrict that to serious injury crashes, it's 22 miles per hour. So we're, for many of these SGO crashes, we're like an order of magnitude lower in severity than a typical human crash database. And so the takeaway message here is it's not appropriate to compare all SGO crashes without any subsetting to police reported data because of this bias in reporting. So like I mentioned, one of the most ubiquitous data sources we have for human crashes are police report databases. They have a long history. Both the federal government, NHTSA, as well as states and localities maintain police accident report or police crash report databases. An important point here is a police crash report has to be issued, and there's differing requirements based on the states. So each state gets to define their police reporting thresholds, and because of that, it's not appropriate to use a national average. So national averages are useful for policymaking. We want to know the number of crashes nationally, but because these ADS are mostly being operated in specific counties of the US, it's much better to use the state data from those counties when you're doing these comparisons, because different states have different reporting requirements. Kara, you mentioned ride-hailing data. So that's actually something we have not been able to do a comparison towards yet. It would be really nice to get a ride-hailing benchmark, but today the only thing we have is from the California Public Utilities Commission, or CPUC. This reporting is required by any transportation network company. So this fancy name for Uber and Lyft. And annually they have to report crashes to the CPUC. Like the AV DMV reports, there's no similar reporting requirement outside of California, so there's only California reporting. I think the biggest issue with this data source, and there's been a couple studies that have tried to use this as a benchmark, is we really don't know what the reporting threshold is for this CPUC data, and so it makes it hard to compare to AV data. It's self-reported by the company, so the language in the law is very, very vague. It just says report your crashes. It doesn't say like above a property damage threshold. It doesn't say only when an injury is reported. And it also doesn't require the companies to report severity. So it just says these are the number of crashes we had. It seems unlikely that minor crashes are reported. Just like think if you were in an Uber and a Lyft and the driver like bumped another car or scratched another car and just drove away, you might not even notice that as a passenger. You may not want to bother yourself by reporting it to the company. The drivers certainly don't have incentive to report crashes because it probably leads to them being kicked off the platform. And so without further description of like what the reporting practices are, I'm just not sure this is a good comparison, at least to the AV data. Another interesting fact is like companies got wise to this and started redacting most of the data as confidential business information. So only data from 2020 and only one company, Uber, is considered complete and it's been used for this. And that has the drawback of it's during the COVID-19 pandemic where travel patterns were disrupted. And we have different data showing how crash rates really went haywire during COVID. And so it's unlikely that this 2020 data is a good measure of non-COVID times. The last data source I'll talk about is third-party liability insurance claims. So a third-party liability claim is when another party's insurance asks for payment from the insured party. And the reason they're asking is because they think the other party is at fault. And a lot of people ask this question, is like, do autonomous vehicles have the same insurance? Is it different? It's exactly the same. We carry insurance just like a human driver, and we work with human driver insurance, and they can submit claims just like any other driver. And these claims have been used as kind of a well-established safety impact data source. Of course, IHS has done a lot of that work in the US looking at things like AAB, lane departure warning, other vehicle technologies. Claims also have a pretty high reporting threshold. And just as a point of reference, only 5% of Waymo's SGO crashes have a third-party liability claim. So if they're more rare, you need more miles to get a statistical result. But it's another, I think, appealing data source for looking at these safety impact studies. All right, so to wrap up about what outcomes and what data sources are available, this is a table of the types of crashes you could look at, and going from kind of least severe, like all contact events, all property damage, all the way up through maybe the most severe, which would be a serious injury or a fatality. Due to Waymo's current scale, which I'll get to in a second, we're starting to have enough miles to really look at these actual injury outcomes. And I think we should favor these instead of the property damage ones, because they're the actual thing we're trying to prevent, right? If we were early on, we had a small number of miles, maybe we need to look at property damage, but there's problems with like property damage crashes aren't the same as serious injury crashes. So if it's possible, which it is now, we should really be looking at these higher severity outcomes when we're looking retrospectively. Okay, so I'll wrap up by kind of looking at some of the studies that we've done at Waymo, looking at these. I'm not sure about the audience if you know what Waymo is, probably you do, but just in case, we're a autonomous vehicle technology company. Right now, our main product is running a 24/7 ride-hailing service. So this is fully autonomous vehicles, nobody in the driver's seat, steering the car. And we're in a couple cities now: San Francisco, Phoenix, Los Angeles, Austin, and Atlanta. We're primarily in these studies looking at our rider-only service. So during early testing, we have safety drivers behind the wheel. We think this is kind of a different beast and a different thing. And it's also something we don't do as much anymore. We did this during the early development, and now most of our miles are coming from this fully autonomous service. And we just announced recently we've passed 100 million RO miles, which date back all the way to March 2020 when we launched our first service. So the main kind of vehicle we've been disseminating this research is this Safety Impact Data Hub website. So you can go to waymo.com/safety/impact. And we wanted to leverage the best research practices to kind of explain to the general public exactly what our safety data is trying to show. So we tried to use these best practices and make it really digestible for the average person. So you can kind of, if you go to the website, you can see it has a lot of like nice looking graphs and very simple language. It's not really meant for researchers, in-depth people. It's meant for the general public. We do feel it's very important to base all of this work on peer-reviewed research. I think that's the best way we have currently to kind of guard against biases. Of course, we have an interest in making our service appear safe, and so we really should be held to a high standard of kind of being transparent and showing our work. And for maybe more interest for this audience, we also try to provide the underlying data. So if you scroll all the way down to the bottom of this website, you can download the raw case lists, like which SGO crashes have which outcome, the miles driven. We also provide some mileage distribution within the geos too. So I touched on all of these, but just to bring it back to exactly what we're doing here, the research question is, how does the Waymo rider-only crash rate compare to human benchmarks of the current overall human-driven fleet? We're deriving benchmarks in this data set from state crash and vehicle miles traveled, VMT data. In the states we're operating, the Waymo data is pulled from the standing general order crash data. And as I mentioned, there's no requirement for mileage. So that's something we're doing voluntarily. We're self-reporting our mileage on the data hub. A little bit about the data alignment. We are subsetting both data sources, particularly on the human side, to only passenger vehicle collisions. So not it has to involve at least one passenger vehicle, because that's what we're a passenger vehicle fleet. We're restricted to surface streets, so we don't do almost any driving on freeways right now. We're restricted to surface streets, so that's important. And we're pulling data from the states in the counties that we operate in, which are rather few at this point. The outcomes we're looking at are serious injury or worse. So this is a K or an A on the CABCO scale, incapacitating or killed. We look at airbag deployments, and then we look at any injury reported to kind of get a broad view of these safety relevant outcomes. The any injury reported benchmark uses a underreporting correction that's based on a NHTSA study by Blinko et al. The serious injury or worse and the airbag do not use an underreporting adjustment. And then all outcomes use this location-based dynamic benchmark correction, which I don't have time to go into depth today, but basically Waymo is a ride-hailing service, so we drive more in the densest parts of cities than the overall human fleet. And so we do a weighting of the human benchmark to these densely populated areas, because it happens to be that these densely populated areas have higher crash rates than the suburbs. So here's what the results look like. This is comparing the Waymo experience crashes to an average human driver that would have driven the same. In this case, it's 71 million miles through March 2025. And the top row, the green bars, are the overall crash reductions, all crash types. So we saw 88% fewer serious injury or worse crashes, 79% fewer airbag deployment crashes, and 78% fewer injury-causing crashes. And because percentages sometimes are a little abstract, we also are reporting here the number of crashes reduced. So this is, again, comparing it to the average benchmark, how many fewer crashes that the Waymo get in. And so, the more we drive, the more these numbers go up, but it's good to contextualize over these few years. We've prevented 15, we had 15 fewer serious injury crashes, 94 fewer airbag deployment crashes, and 223 fewer injury-causing crashes. The bottom row, Kara did a great job of talking about vulnerable road users. We also care a lot about that in dense urban places that we drive in. And we see similar or even higher reductions when we're just looking at these vulnerable road user crashes. So 93% reduction in pedestrian crashes, 81% reduction in cyclists, and 86% reduction in motorcyclists. All of these VRU ones are injury-causing crashes, since airbags usually don't go off when you hit a vulnerable road user. Another thing we've recently been able to add is breaking that overall crash rate down into crash types. So that vulnerable road user result was one of them, but we have a couple of crash groups here. I think 8 are shown here for the injury reported. And this again shows the number of crashes that an average human would have had versus what the Waymo experienced in the blue. And if the reduction is statistically significant, then there's a label with the percent reduction here. I think this is a useful way to look at the benchmarks because it shows you which crashes are the most frequent in these ODDs. So we're talking about dense urban surface streets. So it's not surprising that intersection crashes make up the most of these injury-causing crashes, which makes sense. It's where the highest amount of energy is. You have crossing traffic, people running red lights, and that's where we see one of the biggest reductions in magnitude. So we have 96% reduction in these intersection crashes. We're also having reductions in others. So the takeaway here is this kind of helps tell the story of like where are these crash reductions coming from? And it's intersections, vulnerable road users, lateral crashes, and single vehicle crashes where we're seeing the biggest reductions. You might notice this V2V F2R, which stands for vehicle to vehicle front to rear or rear end crashes. There is a slight reduction, but it's not as big. And so you might wonder what's going on with that. So in a recent paper that we put out, so this is slightly different mileage. So this is 56 million miles at the time of this paper. We did break down this front to rear result into striking and struck. So striking means the Waymo vehicle ran into somebody else. So struck caused a rear end crash, and struck means the Waymo vehicle was struck from behind. So the left graph is showing, again, the number of crashes benchmark versus Waymo. These left three are airbag deployment, striking, struck, and all front to rear. The right three are injury-causing crashes. And what you can see is that for these outcomes, so injury-causing crashes and airbag crashes, there's 0 observed front to rear striking events. So the Waymo driver is very good at not rear-ending other vehicles. You can see that there's a slightly elevated and even airbag result, and then somewhat elevated injury-causing result for the Waymo. And these are not statistically significant because we're cutting the benchmark by these number of crashes, so we still don't have enough miles to make statistically significant claims. But it does appear the trend is that we either do not reduce front to rear struck crashes in case of airbag, or may increase them for injury causing crashes. And so you might wonder, why is that? I think we need some more research on this, but one thing we looked at in this paper was the vehicle maneuver, so the Waymo vehicle maneuver before being struck in these front to rear struck crashes. And this is the percentage of those crashes by the Waymo vehicle maneuver. The blue ones are like normal driving. So dark blue is it's stopped for more than 5 seconds. So this means like in traffic or at a stoplight, stop sign. The middle blue is traveling at constant speed or accelerating. So starting from a stop or just traveling straight. And then the lightest blue is braking, but at a small, relatively light magnitude, so less than 3.5 meters per second squared. The green ones is where the braking is higher than 3.5 meters per second. So this is like a harder brake than you would expect for just normal driving. And that doesn't happen, the hard braking doesn't happen in the airbag deployment crashes in this data set. And it's only just under a quarter of the injury reported. So if you do the math and you assume, okay, maybe if you assume this hard braking is all unnecessary, which, we didn't do that in this study, and I don't think you can say that, it still doesn't explain why this injury result is kind of elevated for Waymo. So like I said, I think we need more data on this. We need some clever ways to look at crash contribution. It's not so simple as saying a hard brake means that the Waymo vehicle was at fault. But one theory we have is that certain crash modes, you have less control. You have less to do to avoid the crash. Clearly in intersection crashes, we're having a huge reduction. You usually have some sort of out in intersection crash. You cannot enter the intersection, you can brake, you can swerve. In a lot of these rear end crashes, as you can see, we're just kind of sitting ducks, or we're just doing normal stuff and people come up and hit us. There's just less opportunity for us to avoid these struck. So it's an interesting trend to look at over time. And it might be that in certain crash modes, you're not going to see as big reductions as in others. Okay, so the last study I'll highlight is one on third-party liability insurance data. So this study was done in partnership with Swiss Re. They're the largest reinsurance company in the world. So this is, you may have not have heard it because they're not selling you insurance, they sell insurance to the insurance companies. And so they have access to kind of a large aggregate data set of human insurance claims. And so they provided human third-party liability claims rates in the zip codes that Waymos operates in. And they have a lot of data, 200 billion miles traveled. And we did a paper that compared property damage liability claims and bodily injury claims over 25 million RO miles. And this was done almost a year ago. And this is what the result looks like. The left pane is property damage claims rate in claims per million miles traveled. Right is bodily injury claims. There were two benchmarks, so the blue and the yellow. The blue is all drivers insured in the sample. Then the gold is new latest generation human-driven vehicles, and this means model years 2018 to 2021. These were the newest vehicles in the data set. And you can see that newer vehicles tend to crash less, and we don't know exactly why from this data, but it could be because of new crash avoidance features that have been shown to be effective. It could be the populations are different, so people who buy new cars may be different than the overall driving population. But regardless of the reasons, it's kind of like a higher bar. It has a lower crash rate. And then the green bars on these charts are the Waymo rider-only insurance claims rate. And even at this higher bar, the latest generation vehicles, we still see about the same reductions as we see in the overall crash rate. So 86% property damage claims, 90% reduction in bodily injury claims. And so I think both of these views, the overall crash rate as well as the insurance claims, are important because they kind of tell you different things. Okay, so just concluding, we do have best practices now, or we're starting to have best practices how to do these studies. So the RAVE checklist exists, and we're working on an ISO standard that can provide guidance in how to interpret and do these studies. And we're hoping that our approach to doing safety impact research by publishing papers that are peer reviewed and providing data for downloads on our website helps other researchers do their own research. So certainly if you have questions about these data sources or doing these sort of studies, I'm happy to answer questions. So thanks a lot for your attention, and I guess I'll pass it to Eric.
Well, I think we might ask you just a couple of quick questions, if that's all right, Eric. Sarang mentioned that people often claim that the human driver strikes the AV in the rear because the AV behaves unpredictably, and we wonder how often this is the case when you're reviewing these videos and that sort of thing. I mean, they might be protecting the pedestrian right in front of them, and that's what, so in order to, you're paying Peter to short Paul or something, so you might be protecting one class of drivers, but creating a little bit of mischief on the back end.
Yeah, and that's what I think there is need for more research and clearer definitions about like what is unpredictable. So I think like we have a pretty good subjective sense, but what I say is unpredictable might be different than what you say. And also, what is predictable for the person behind you is maybe not, if you know all of the situations, you have a omniscient view, it's not so unpredictable. And so that's why we ended up just looking at kind of objective maneuvers based on like, was the vehicle stopped? Was it braking lightly? Was it braking heavily? That gives you some of the question, but like, as you're suggesting, it's not answering the question of why the braking was happening. And so I think like all of these crashes are available by the SGO. And so you can go and look at the narratives that we submit that talk about this. But I think we just didn't feel like there's a good objective way to define unexpected, right? It's kind of, I think we need things like this. And one other piece of evidence, which, is maybe not conclusive because you need a lot of miles for this. We don't have any third-party liability claims for being rear-ended. So it hasn't happened yet that we've braked hard enough or unexpected enough that somebody else was able to get payment from us. So that's, it's when you cut it that many ways, it's not a statistically significant result, surely, but I think if there was this widespread problem of AVs or Waymos driving so unpredictably, we would have a lot of insurance claims that would show that, and we don't see that.
Right, right. So I talk about it as practically negligible at this point. So that's great. And Sarang, I drive around and walk around Waymos all the time here. I guess there's still only 100 in the Austin geofence, and the geofence was just expanded, but I see 2 or 3 a day. So and yeah, they drive the speed limit, which could be a problem, especially if you're going downhill. And they just recently were allowed to drive a little bit more aggressively or honk at people who cut them off, which I'm a proponent of. If you're driving badly, we need to wake you up. So I'll honk at people who are driving dangerously. But yeah, I feel that they drive very predictably. Although if there's suddenly like a cone or some weird situation, you might see them like a regular driver here in the US just shift lanes quickly sometimes to kind of, because they're having to change, what they thought they were going to do, just like you or I would. So that's the only time where I thought it was a little unpredictable, but I think a human would have done the same thing. Chris, I did want to ask you, you've driven 100 million miles in rider only, and I think we have about 1.3 deaths for that kind of distance across all types of roadways and settings here in the United States. And your cars, I think, drive a little bit more at night, but and also, as you mentioned, almost exclusively on local roads for that 100 million miles. And I'm wondering, what is the equivalent crash rate for the US, not just your 4 geofences or whatever, your 3 geofences, however you want to slice it, but is it about 2 that people would have expected driving at on those kinds of streets?
Yeah, I think I can look up the exact figure, but I think the one I have in memory is that for our geos, so San Francisco, LA, Phoenix, Austin on surface street, you would have expected to see around 3 fatalities at this point. I think those cities are higher than the national average surface street because you get rural non divided roads get into there. So I think the national average is actually less than the urban average, but
Yeah, I
so
don't
we
think it's
have
because of undivided roadways. I think it's because of the complexity of the urban settings. And of course, the homeless population can be a big contributor in LA and San Francisco, depending on where your geofences are. Okay, great. And then the last question, you mentioned that they reconstruct these crashes. How often do they tap the black box to get that Delta V number?
yeah, the national database of CIS, which does around, I think, 3,000 crashes are investigated per year, and those are sampled throughout the US. That's the largest sample where they will get event data recorders. This is near and dear to my heart because a lot of my grad work was done in event data recorders using event data recorder data. It used to be that not a lot of vehicles had those. It was like, 10%, 20%. I think in the most recent years of data, it's getting very high. It's like 60% of vehicles they do an EDR download, and that's codified and like entered into the CIS database. So
Okay, so of those 3,000, they might get 1,800 now. Okay,
yeah.
and those are a true random sample of all police reported crashes?
They have an additional requirement that it has to be towed away. One vehicle must be towed away. So it's a
Thank
little
you.
bit more severe even than I think that the issue is they guard very closely where the sampling is done. So it's anonymous throughout the country. And it's only about 20 or 30 sites in the country. So I don't think it's going back to this like localized crash rate. We're seeing really big differences in local crash rates. And so that's kind of prevented us, or we haven't looked as much at the CIS data, but we did in some of our very early papers just to look at like the Delta V distributions. It's very interesting. And that's where we came up with this Delta V less than 1 mile per hour, just because it's such a huge contrast, because a lot of people know about the EDRs and the Delta V from CIS, and it really is just like a different data source altogether.
Great, great. Okay, well, thank you so much, Eric. We're going to shift to you, but Chris, you may want to take a look at the chat box, just see what's been going on there. Ben had a nice comment there as you were speaking. Eric, feel free to just take over the screen, and Chris, feel free to stop sharing. Great.
All right, let me work on this for a second, get the slides up. Maybe, come on. All right, there we go. So yeah, so let me start off with a couple things. So first of all, thanks, Cara, for not only the invite, but also your intro about how the US is kind of behind when it comes to road safety. You know, we just had a big press release about that, talking about Canada and talking about the other OECD countries. And it's a big reason for a goal that we're putting out there called 30 by 30, which we hope you and everyone else shares in, which is to reduce traffic fatalities 30% by 2030. You know, that'll involve prioritizing fatalities, prioritizing things that can have a big impact in the population quickly. And we have a website. My screen is being weird, but I'll put it in the chat in a little bit. But it's iihs.org/30x30. It has a whole description of this idea as well as some other materials, and those will continue growing over time. And also, thank you, Chris, for apologizing for stealing my thunder. But the more you steal, the more time I have to talk about anything I want. So that's kind of fun. So I'm here, and I think this is going to be a really good follow-on to what Chris was talking about. So I'm going to focus on crash reporting differences between level 4 vehicles and human drivers. And also I'm focusing on level 4 because I'm really talking about the same type of thing Chris was talking about, which is vehicles that don't have a driver in the driver's seat. And for reasons I won't get into here, lower levels of automation like level 2 and level 3 that sit in people's driveway affect some of the crash reporting things I'm going to be talking about. So right now we are truly talking about driverless AVs. So let's jump into the reporting issues. So when it comes to human drivers, as Chris said, we're typically referring to police reported data. And, you know, these data are collected everywhere. Unfortunately, there are 51 different versions of these data because, you know, it's a state level thing and everyone does it differently, but it is fundamentally the same stuff that's collected. So you can file a police report if somebody was injured or killed, or there was some minimum value of property damage. The most common value is $1,000, but it ranges from not very much to 3,000 or whatever. But it's important to note that this is really an on-scene guesstimated amount. And if your car is broken in half or something, it's pretty easy to say you've exceeded that threshold. But if there's some bumper damage and you're sitting there looking at it, it's even for a professional, it's pretty much impossible to tell whether that amount of damage exceeds $1,000 or even 3,000. So I think these thresholds, they're just sort of a guideline. They're not really set in stone. And it's also worth pointing out that typically police reported data is restricted to public roads. So if you're in your driveway and you rear end or back into and damage your wife's car, you're probably not going to report that to police for a variety of reasons. But then in terms of whether people actually report stuff, you know, the picture is interesting. So, you know, the study Chris mentioned, they surveyed American drivers and said, did you get in a crash? Did you report it to police? In terms of what people consider to have been a crash, they reported less than half of those to police. And researchers often will try to get around this issue by only looking at injury crashes. But even still, there's about a third of injury crashes that don't get reported to police. Now, when we talk about level 4 vehicles, self-driving vehicles, as Chris said, there's a requirement that they be reported under the Standing General Order, the SGO. And this is nice because it's a national level reporting system. So California DMV has something rather similar, but we don't want 51 different versions of that. And again, here you have to report the crash if someone was injured or killed. It's pretty straightforward. Or if there was property damage of any amount, or if there was alleged property damage. And the way the old one was written was if there was any physical contact with another road user, you had to report it. Or if there were any vulnerable road user involved at all in any way, including not contacting any vehicle, that had to be reported. And that changed in April of this year. They put some minimum reporting criteria on there. They restricted it to public roads, things like that, but there will still be issues and differences between this and police reported data. So in particular, these level 4 crashes, they include super minor things like curb strikes or scraping the undercarriage or popping a tire on a pothole. And I know you can define crashes in lots of different ways, but most of us in our normal driving would not consider any of these things to be crashes in the first place. There are also a lot of crashes there that are clearly in manual mode, not as in if there was a test driver in the vehicle, not just a last second disengagement to avoid a crash, but they were clearly just driving the car themselves, having engaged automation pretty soon before the crash. And there are also quite a few that are not on public roads. So taking a look at a few examples of these narratives, in the first one, what we see is that the Waymo vehicle was turning into a parking lot, and it basically just scraped undercarriage a little bit. I believe this one, they said that there was damage, but that could be anything as minor as a little bit of scratching. This one was not towed, nothing happened. There's no reason to consider this a crash. Here's one from Zooks in a hotel loading zone, which will not be considered a public roadway. And this is one where somebody in another vehicle opened a door and bumped into the AV. Most of the time, we wouldn't consider this a crash. We've all seen this happen in parking lots and so forth. One thing that's highlighted here is that, the door had made contact with a sensor on the Zooks vehicle. And some of these AV sensors cost, God knows what, $40,000 or something. So, I mean, in some technical sense, maybe if you damage that, there might be a lot of monetary damage. But if you open the door in the same way into a Honda Accord or a BMW or some other vehicle, that type of action is not representative of what ends up in police crash reports. So we don't consider this to be comparable to that. And then here's just an example where, they say the ADS was not engaged, the test driver was clearly operating in manual mode and got in a crash. So this really has very little, or has nothing to do with the level 4 automation. So what we see is in terms of the crash data, the numerators, these aren't apples to apples comparisons directly. They're collected in very different ways, different thresholds, different practices, all kinds of stuff. Level 4 vehicles right now are operated by companies, human drivers, make their own decisions. And there are some ways to address this. So one of them, which I'm going to talk more about, is to take the level 4 data and remove those crash involvements that are unlike what a normal person would report to police. There's the other direction of that is to take the human driver data and add estimates of underreporting to that. That kind of assumes that what people underreport to police is like what companies are reporting to the SGO, which may or may not be accurate, but is not unreasonable at all. Another way, which Chris mentioned, was to find some kind of common measure like airbag deployment. That's very straightforward to report on both types of data sets. And then, of course, there's the option of using stuff that's not publicly available, like naturalistic driving studies or insurance claims. But an important point here is that there is no perfect method, there is no perfect data source. They all have different strengths and weaknesses, and therefore they all kind of complement each other when they're used well. So the more, the more conclusions we have from a variety of different methods and data sources, the stronger is our overall knowledge. So I'm going to talk about some work we've done. So we published this paper in 2017, looking at what was then called the Google Self-Driving Car Project. And the method we have to work on this is to define a concept of police reportable level 4 crash involvement. And what this is really is trying to identify those crashes that meet the police reporting threshold and the rather subjective threshold of what would a normal person typically report to police. And again, if we ignore the issue of very expensive sensory equipment and that type of thing. And this is a little bit subjective and unapologetically so. So the way we determine this primarily is by reading the narratives. And going back to that question that Chris got about AVs behaving strangely and getting rear-ended and all that, in the 2017 study and in the SGO narratives, we've read all of these, and we've seen that happen very, very few times. So by and large, it is just people rear-ending them because people are people. So reading the narratives is the primary way. Using coded data elements is another way. Like, again, for example, if they said the airbag went off, we're definitely saying that's police reportable. Two other possible ways is by looking at video or photographs, or by using onboard data like Delta V, but these aren't currently publicly available, so we're not doing those right now. And so what are we finding is that back in our 2017 study with our ginormous sample size of 10, what we found was that the vast majority of crash involvements for all 4 vehicles were not police reportable. And we're working on a current study now using the SGO with a sample size of over 700, and we're seeing pretty much the same thing. There is a little bit of gray area here in that there are some situations where we really don't have a good sense of whether we think it's police reportable or not. But by and large, it's the same story. It's the vast majority of the stuff in here is not comparable to what humans report to police. And so we're not going to consider it in the analysis. So it's a lot of work to remove 3/4 of the sample, basically. And why is this important? Is because when you calculate crash rates, if you ignore this issue, you get this massive statistical bias. So on the left-hand side is the crash rate computed for police reportable crashes, and here I'm including the maybes. And on the right-hand side is what the rate would look like if you include the stuff we really don't consider police reportable. And in this case, it's about a 300% bias. And I mean, that's quite a bit. We usually don't like to see a 30% bias. So this is something pretty insane. But remember, this is something we want to compare with human drivers, okay? So imagine what would happen if the police reported human driver crash rates, is right here at this level. Now, not only would you have a gigantic bias, but it actually, whether you have this bias or not, changes the entire direction of your conclusion. So it's a really important thing to get this right, or to address it somehow at least. And again, as Chris mentioned, thank you, Chris, for going into that. I actually deleted 2 slides from my presentation, but we and a bunch of people worked together on the RAVE checklist, and this is a guide to help researchers do these studies, but also help other people read these studies. In some cases, there may be people like regulators or policymakers that are not researchers and want to assess whether the study they're reading is of high quality. This is also a useful tool in the peer review process when you're reviewing a paper. It's nice to have something to go by and check on it, especially if you haven't done one of these studies yourself. And, he had a cool QR code with a dinosaur in the middle. I'm not so cool, so I made a tiny URL. I only am so uncool that I just learned a few months ago that you can make your own tiny URLs. So it is rave-checklist. That'll take you right to the paper. And so that's what I have for you today. I will encourage you to check out our website and social media for more information on this, as well as everything else we do. You can check out our crash test videos, see how your car did, and decide whether you should crash it or not, or if it would be safe to do so. There's a lot of research on there. There's a bunch of statistics on fatalities, so on and so forth. And here's my email as well if you have any questions, and I'll try to get the chat back on and see if there are any here now.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, I have a question for Chris in the chat box when you mentioned, ignoring the cost of those sensors. And I did put your IHS 30 by 30, as well as a recent paper, a 2025 paper about the rave checklist into that chat box. So any questions that you guys have for Eric right now? I'm surprised I'm the only one with questions these days. And Chris, feel free to answer anything live if you like.
So I see your comment about lots of people are hurt in parking lots.
Oh, yeah.
I don't mean to ignore the problem. I'm only saying that when we compare with police reported data, those are public roads, so that's what we are kind of focusing on to make the comparison.
And so Eric, a lot of crash costs on the property damage only collisions are from delays imposed on others. And when you look at these and they don't warrant it, there might be $1,000 worth of delays caused. Are you also trying to estimate those with the congestion levels at that location and the other effects?
No, we're not considering delays and things like that. Just the property
I think those are really important to report to police, and I think they should be recorded because, I think that's a really serious social cost. Even if you're just your tire goes down, it's not really a crash, but you have just caused a very serious incident where you do need emergency personnel if you're in the midst of a lot of fast-moving traffic and that kind of thing. So to me, it's not a crash, it's an incident, but it is a reason for a lot of, congestion costs in this country.
Yeah, and one thing I meant to say about the police reported data is that, it's a very important tool, and it's not perfect, but, we have decades of using it to understand road safety, and it's just really important. Any data set can be made better, but I think it's more efficient to just work around the limitations of the police data or any data set for that matter, rather than just trying to change the world and to make the data perfect.
Oh, yeah. Here in Texas, they were noticing that the Round Rock police, which is where Dell is located, weren't reporting a lot of crashes, and TxDOT had to get on them because those police had decided, you know what, let's not do this anymore. On a lot of the collisions, which was really unfortunate. But yeah, I just want to remind everybody that, delays are a big cost, and the anxiety and other things that sort of non-economic costs that come with incidents of all types on the roadways and not just highways. So we've got Carol Flanagan. So if you could stop sharing, Eric, that'd be great.
Sure.
Lynn's going to go ahead and play Carol's tape for us, and then Missy Cummings will be our last speaker.
Can you see my screen, Dr. K?
Yes.
Okay, just let me know if the audio not works. So now I will show her slides now.
Hi, everybody. I'm Carol Flanagan from the University of Michigan Transportation
Sounds
Research
great, but it's in
Institute, and I'm going to talk about validation of safety surrogates for AV driving assessment. And I apologize for not being able to be here live. I'm double booked for briefings at this time. So why are we talking about surrogates? Why is surrogates in the title of my talk?
Lynn, I had to stop you because I guess you can't hear me, but we are seeing it in slideshow presenter mode, so we need to see it in full screen mode.
Oh, let me check. 1 second.
So she got audio, which is no mean feat, you guys. We've been having some issues. We have different video files that people are sharing with us, and hers is a PPTXS, which is really easy to do within PowerPoint. But
This is screen 2. I'm sharing this screen. And let me play again and
go into full screen mode, right? Slideshow. Did you try that? There you
it's this
Yeah.
screen, right? You are seeing this screen?
We're seeing also this the side screen. So can you hit that slide deck down at the bottom? Yeah, try that.
Hi, everybody. I'm Carol Flanagan from the University of Michigan Transportation Research Institute, and I'm going to talk about validation of safety surrogates for AV driving.
Why it stopped?
You can try hitting down arrow and see if it advances.
So why are we talking about surrogates? Why is surrogates in the title of my talk? Well, kind of obviously, the simplest way to assess safety or to assess the safety of AVs would be to drive them as intended, observe crashes, compute rates, and compare to a benchmark. But as Keller and Paddock demonstrated clearly, crashes are rare enough that it requires too many miles in order to be able to show statistical significance of a technology that is, even like in the case of a technology that's 20% better than a current human being, which is pretty big effect. And so it just isn't realistic or practical to drive that many miles, and especially not in the context of kind of development, technology development. So what a surrogate does is, or what a surrogate is that it is an outcome that you can measure that happens more often than crashes, much more often, but is related or relatable to crash risk. Surrogates are actually used all the time in traffic safety, especially in the last couple of decades. So when you hear near crashes or near misses, those are surrogates. Hard braking is a surrogate that's used all the time, especially in insurance and other things. Hard swerving typically goes along with that. But this issue and the use of surrogates is not unique to traffic safety. So any situation in which the outcome that you're interested in is rare enough that it just takes too many resources to test a treatment, test a countermeasure, AVs are a countermeasure, and then wait for the outcomes to develop, is kind of subject to this basic conundrum, right? So epidemiology, which is concerned with treatments for disease and things like that, has really worked. There's a ton of work in the epidemiology literature on the theory and practice of using surrogates, and they do so in a causal inference framework. Surrogates are used in medical device testing, and the FDA has clear guidelines for the required evidence for the validity of the surrogate. So here's some stuff from the FDA website that I think you can easily see the analogs to traffic safety. So first off, you can use a surrogate endpoint when the clinical outcome might take a long time to study, as in our case. Before the surrogate endpoint can be accepted in place of a clinical outcome, there has to be extensive evidence accumulated for that surrogate as being a good surrogate. Surrogate endpoints that have undergone this extensive testing are called validated, and then they have a mechanism to do it sort of with a little bit less evidence, kind of on the basis of reasonably likely to predict a clinical benefit. So the way that epidemiology goes about validating surrogates or thinking about surrogates is through this causal inference framework, and the framework emphasizes graphical representation of a causal model. So a directed acyclic graph, or a DAG, is used to describe a causal model being proposed. And the words, directed just means that you're only allowed one directional arrows and you're not allowed to go in circles. And the patterns in the DAGs influence the way epidemiologists do their analysis, and in this case, it is related to how we want to think about surrogates. So a surrogate that is on the causal pathway between a treatment, so think AVs, and outcome, think crashes, is one sort of role that a surrogate can play in a DAG. And you can see the dotted green line is kind of representing an alternate pathway from, let's say, for AVs to get into crashes, but not experience a particular surrogate. So in traffic safety world, I think often like causal pathway can be thought of as equivalent to kinematic pathway. So in this case, the question is, if you have a crash, will a surrogate, which, would be like a threshold on a metric or, something like that, will it occur in the course of that crash? Or is it possible to have a crash where that surrogate does not occur? Surrogates do not have to be on the causal pathway necessarily. So they can actually be sort of separate. They can be influenced by the treatment, and crashes also be influenced by the treatment in such a way that the surrogate can still stand in for the treatment. However, we prefer surrogates that are on the causal or kinematic pathway. So surrogates on the causal pathway will typically have a stronger association with crash risk. They will typically be controlled by similar mechanisms as crashes because they're on the pathway. Examples would be things like time to collision, post-encroachment time. Surrogates not on the causal pathway typically have a weaker association with crash risk because they can occur at other times. They might be controlled by different mechanisms. And examples of this are hard braking and sort of lane keeping behavior. So we could draw a DAG just to illustrate for traffic safety. And here I have one. So the idea is that you've got a driver, and drivers drive differently. Like it may be because of their age or just their style, but drivers can engage in more or less close following. They can be more or less attentive. And when they are close following or when they're inattentive, that will influence the frequency with which they experience short time to collision. So let's say less than 1 second time to collision, and we'll call it longitudinal time to collision. Time to collision causally influences your ability to avoid a crash when something happens. So you're following closely, you have a short time to collision, the driver in front of you brakes hard, and when you're close and closing, you have limited ability to avoid. Now, hard braking is a way that you try to do that. So hard braking can certainly influence whether a crash occurs, but it does not have to occur on the pathway to rear-end crashes. So this is sort of the idea that I mean. So what makes a good surrogate? So Tarko, and there's a group led by Andrew Tarko back in 2009 that put together a white paper, and they looked into the medical literature on surrogates, and they kind of came up with a couple of qualities in traffic safety domain, one of which is they suggest that a surrogate measure should be based on an observable non-crash event, so that's what we're talking about, that is physically related in a predictable and reliable way. So that's kind of the idea of the surrogate on the causal pathway that I'm talking, or the kinematic pathway. Then they go further to say there should be a practical method for converting the number of non-crash events, or the magnitude, into a corresponding crash frequency. Technically, this is not a requirement that the FDA imposes, but this is a very useful quality, in particular because when we want to do benchmarking, we'd like to benchmark against let's say a crash rate from humans, but we'd like to get but we might only be able to measure surrogates for AVs, and so we'd like to be able to do that translation. But note that the translation is yet another sort of level of difficulty, but very useful. So to assess surrogates, the first step in developing a good surrogate is to make a causal argument and in assessing it. So there is no way to prove that a surrogate works. So the argument that you make is really critical. People have to look at that and say, yes, okay, I see that you're making this argument about, let's say time to collision, but someone can kind of come and say, yeah, well, time to collision is good, but you can actually have a good time to collision. You can fail to fire a surrogate, but still be following extremely closely. So if you're following extremely closely, but you're going the same speed as the vehicle, time to collision doesn't really sort of reflect the kind of inherent risk. So then maybe we want to we want to go further on time to collision, but this is where the kind of argument comes in. The argument then is supported by analytical tools. There are 3 basic analyses that I'm not describing that are proportion explained, indirect effects, and meta-analysis. I have a little clip from a paper with this really important statement that a correlate does not a surrogate make. So in traffic safety, people are always validating, hard braking in particular, using correlation. Correlation is not evident. It certainly needs to be there because anything that's causal is also going to be correlated, but correlation does not prove that a surrogate is a valid surrogate. It is good. There is more that needs to be done around this. So this is a really important thing that kind of need to bring into the world of traffic safety. So I just have a couple of a few takeaways on 2 slides. First off, to review, finding good surrogates requires an argument and some supporting analyses, and it's really helpful to think about the DAG. It's a really important first step. The best surrogates are likely to be on the causal or kinematic pathway. Each surrogate is only going to apply to a specific subset of crashes. We're never going to get the surrogate to rule them all. And so we have to actually kind of break things down into scenarios and think about different surrogates for different scenarios. Driver motion-based surrogates like hard braking and swerving are easy to measure, but they are just like looking for your keys under the streetlight. They are likely to be less reliable than proximity-based surrogates. They are not necessarily on the causal pathway. And I think we really want to move on from using hard braking for everything to move on to more defensible surrogates. Surrogates for injury crashes really need to be validated against injury crashes. So that's sort of similar to like I was isolating rear end crashes. The real takeaway though for this is that the use of surrogates, which I'd rather not do, is a logical necessity. You can't avoid it. I see no other way around the surrogates in the situation where we want to assess safety using on-road data without waiting for crashes to amass. So in order to do this, we need to move towards a similar approach to using surrogates that's used in medicine. And to do that, we need focused work on validating surrogates using appropriate methods, not just correlation. We need much better validation data sets. Validation data set has to actually have the surrogates and the crashes, and we have frustratingly little of that. And then the community as a whole should be working towards developing a set of validated surrogates and kind of agreeing on them. And there is some work coming up through SAE that's kind of on the verge of being voted on, that's really pushing in that direction that I'm pretty excited about. So want to put that bee in all y'all's bonnet, and really appreciate you taking the time to listen.
Thanks so much for running those slides. And Missy Cummings is here. I introduced you earlier, Missy, but you are welcome to open up your slide deck for us.
Okay, great. I trust you can hear me okay.
Yes.
All right. While the slides are coming up, I want to take this opportunity to address what I consider to be the elephant in the room, which is the number of companies and agencies that continue to twist themselves into pretzels to compare self-driving car operations to average humans. I've written papers, Waymos written papers, Noah Goodall has written, like a bunch of us have all written papers. But I want people to recognize that indeed, this is an apples to oranges comparison. And I really don't think it merits a lot of direct comparison. That is because all self-driving cars have some kind of external oversight. In the case of Waymo, they do have remote assistance operators. In the case of Tesla, it's been reported that they have remote drivers. Various companies do different operations, but this problem or this issue, this architecture, just by default means that these aren't the same. A self-driving car being monitored by a team of people to intervene at a moment's notice is not the same as a human-driven car. Of course, if Waymo wants to run the experiment, for example, where we have 1,000 human-driven cars with remote operators watching our every move, then and then compare them to their cars, then that's going to be a more direct comparison. And this is all the backdrop for my talk today. I'm going to talk in detail about remote supervision of self-driving cars, but I want to be clear. There are no true self-driving cars on the road. No company is not doing remote operations. So this gets missed a lot. Indeed, it's a completely unregulated area. We'll talk more about it, but we need to be clear and honest. These cars are being remotely supervised, that they have an advantage then, one that humans don't have. Indeed, it should be an advantage, but in some cases, what I'm going to talk about is that it if not done correctly, it can be a disadvantage. Okay, so to give you some of my background, I am a very grumpy old fighter pilot. I have been talking all day about generative AI and trying to walk people off the ledge about how they think AGI is here and everyone's losing our jobs. People have lost their minds about AI. And my former history as a fighter pilot just really, I dig in deep to that, curmudgeon fighter pilot spirit because, I do feel like that people have gone crazy with what they think AI can do. I personally, after I flew fighters for the Navy, then I got out and went back to school, got my PhD, started doing a lot of research in drones. And so this was really my entree into safety critical systems, although I did a lot of aircraft research, drones. I did that for a while until it became really a commercialized market. And then I started work in self-driving cars, and shout out to Google X at this time. And then eventually they became Waymo. I mean, they sponsored this original research. In this study, we are looking at basically what would become autopilot later, although this was many years before autopilot. It was the idea that your car would be doing longitudinal control and or lateral control, and how would people on long drives react. And we were actually looking at their blood oxygenation levels in their brain using a functional near infrared spectroscopy, because the idea is that we knew they were going to get bored. And so the question is, could we actually see that brain signature in the human's blood oxygenation uptake in their brain? Turned out that humans got bored really quickly. Much to my surprise, I thought after 20 to 30 minutes of driving, we'd start to see people engage in distracting activities, like in this case, you can see the cell phone. But what was really happening is, indeed, we could actually see a change in people's blood oxygenation uptake after 8 minutes. So, this was a big, and the time frame of this is about 2013. So this was a big signal that this driving assist architecture for humans was going to be a disaster. And indeed, I think this is where Google X/Waymo did the right thing. And they were like, nope, we're just going to completely skip over driving assist and go straight to self-driving because humans are so unreliable as system monitors, which I totally agree with. But throughout that my entire career, the bulk of my research has been around remote operations. So this is a picture of a Predator ground control station, a drone ground control station. I spent years sitting in these trailers with people remotely operating drones. These are the big ones. I also spent years with the Army, and they have smaller drones also sitting in the trailers with the Army operators. And so aviation has been learning a lot of important lessons about remote operations for a significant period of time, anywhere from issues with latency, how to design the interfaces, How should you think about staffing models? So I think for most of the people doing remote operations in self-driving cars, trucks, what have you, they're kind of missing a whole host of really awesome lessons learned that we established over a period of about 10 years in the looking at military operations, not the least of which is latency. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I wanted to tell you a really important story that came out of specifically the Predator operations. So originally, when the Predators were designed, the Air Force, because of the pilot mafia, and I was part of that pilot mafia. The pilot mafia did not want to cede control over their jobs to robots. So the Air Force, in its questionable wisdom, decided to let the pilots do takeoff and landing from a place called Creech. It's an Air Force base in Nevada. And then they would take them off, land them, do the missions, and they're from 4,000 miles away. The Air Force lost a ridiculous number of these aircraft, primarily on landing. And lo and behold, it came out that when you're flying something from about 4,000 miles away, you're going to have anywhere from about a 2 to 4 second lag. And that gets you immediately into something we call pilot-induced oscillation. And the pilot would see something or think that they were seeing a real-time signal, respond to that, then they wouldn't see a response right away. Then they double the response. And who among us hasn't done that with our keyboard? You know how sometimes when you type some letters, clickety clack, and you don't see anything. So you click a bunch of more letters, and then all of a sudden you'll get all the letters flooding through. That's effectively what was happening with remote operators and drones. And eventually the Air Force had to stop because we were wasting millions of taxpayer dollars because the latency problem was just more than the system could tolerate. And we knew that then, we being people who work in controls, we knew that time delay, the tau, is deadly. Somehow that piece of information missed, just flew right by General Atomic, who actually built these ground control stations. So that had to be corrected through trial and error, and eventually it was. And so if you think I'm critical of the self-driving world for not learning the lessons of the Air Force, I will tell you the Air Force didn't learn they had to learn the hard way also. I would like to sort of head that off at the pass so it didn't have to be such a big deal. But, understanding that not just the latency problem, which we'll talk about more, but there's just a whole host of problems. Remote operations just are not, I'm going to get a bunch of people in a room and I'm going to give them some driving controls, for example, and then call it a day. That's not how it works. And I find that this part of the design of the self-driving ecosystem is not as well thought out as it should be. So I want to be clear, though, when I'm talking about this, I want everyone to understand that there's actually several different layers of remote operation. So I think the first point that people need to understand is the difference between remote driving versus remote assist. So remote driving is what controls people would call teleoperation. You have access to rate command controls. And what do I mean by that? So if you have distance and you take the derivative of distance, you get velocity. And then if you take the derivative of that, you get acceleration, right? So it's really important to understand that what you have control over as the human is going to determine how controllable that system is, especially in light of time delay. So the remote driving down in the lower right, and for those of you who don't know, I spent about 1.25 years with NHTSA as their senior safety advisor. So I really got to see a lot of these remote control stations from various companies up close and in person. But the idea is that this person has steering wheel, pedal, some version of screens, maybe a map somewhere, maybe not. They've got the headphones so that they can hear potentially what's going. So it's remote presence yet on the road with the ability to do velocity and acceleration control. Now, I don't want to bore you with all the details. I've written a lot of papers about the low-level control mechanics of what is happening with time delay, but safe to say that acceleration control for humans is exceedingly difficult, if not impossible. Rate control, velocity, also very difficult, but doable as long as you have very little delay. And for those of you who follow me on LinkedIn, you know that I am forever on LinkedIn, just going after people for not understanding what is the acceptable time delay. This has not yet been adjudicated. NHTSA is just now sponsoring research to do this. The Missy Cummings estimate is something south of 30 milliseconds of delay for remote driving. And the big driver of that is actually there is delay in communication systems, all sorts of communication systems. But humans just have an inherent half-second delay built in them. It's called the neuromuscular lag. You're not getting around it, right? I mean, it's physics. Light comes into your eye, it hits your lens, it has to get into your brain. You have to understand what is happening. The devices that you have are impoverished. Even if I don't care how high fidelity your screen is, it's still not nearly as good as the real world. And then you're going to have to make decisions based on what you're seeing through the display and then be able to send the commands back. This is why remote driving is incredibly dangerous, incredibly dangerous. I'm not saying it's not possible. It is possible. But generally, in my experience, speeds less than 10 miles an hour are where we see a sufficient use of remote driving. Really, beyond that, the chance that something could happen inside those time delay periods is just too risky, I think, particularly in urban streets and forget highway speeds. No. Now, look, people are going to want to argue with me, and I love arguing about this. But now NHTSA is doing some research that's hopefully going to actually do some hardcore research to do maneuvering envelopes to put an end to this discussion. I would say one of the things that complicates this is it might be the delay. I don't know. I haven't seen anybody use Starlink yet, so I haven't seen any delay reports from Starlink in terms of remote driving. Who knows? That might work. But what I tell you, what won't work is what's typically used right now, which is 3 different cell networks. So multiple companies are using the strategy of, okay, well, we're just going to have our remote signal go. We'll take the best of the 3 cell phone signals that we get. This is not acceptable. Super dangerous. Somebody's going to die if that continues. Okay, so that's remote driving. I am not a fan on civilian roads. Military operations are a whole different bag of, I want to say bag of words, but that's something different. I'm talking about on public roads. Now, contrast that with remote assistance. And I'm showing the picture at the top is in some presentation somewhere, somebody had this. This is what's happening with remote assistance. And the idea is that you are not connected to the velocity component of the car. You're really connected to the position component. Thus, you're able to tell a car, you could, for example, drop breadcrumbs. This is where you could say, okay, go to this point on my path planner. Now go to this point, go to this point. So you're not doing rate control. You're actually giving the car a position to drive to, and then the car does that itself. So that's one form of remote assist. Another form of remote assist that we see is the disambiguation of signs, symbols, signals in the world. So self-driving cars, computer vision systems are quite brittle, means they don't understand, if signs change a little bit, it's often very difficult for them to see. Probably the best example I can tell you of the issues with remote assist, there was a case in California where Caltrans, whatever they call their DMV, there was a light and the Caltrans had moved the light 6 inches. But when the light was moved, the self-driving car could no longer see it. And that's a whole nother discussion about problems with computer vision. Maybe I'll do that on at another conference. But in this particular case, the car didn't see it, had to call back to the remote center and ask a human, where is the light? I don't see the light, and is it safe for me to go? The human saw a yellow light, thought it was safe to go, but because of the latency in the signal, by the time that got back to the car, the light was red and the car turned. So even though, I'm sorry, I should say, and it got hit broadside. So, it hit a car broadside. So there was a crash, people were involved, no one died, but it was a good reminder of everything that we learned way back in the Predator operations, is that even if you don't rely on velocity control, even if you're only relying on position control, latency can still kick you in the butt. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The last form of operations are offshore centers. I'm sorry, not offshore centers. I'll talk about going back to Mountain View. So there's two kinds of remote assist. The remote assist where contractors, for example, this is something that we've seen for Waymo, they have contractors on site who help the cars understand signs, signals, symbols in the world. It's low cost. It's much more cost effective for a company to hire out contractors to be these remote assists. But another layer of remote assist exists back at Mountain View, meaning sometimes the situations are so complicated that the people who are trying to attend to them cannot sufficiently get them solved in time, and they'll escalate. You could think about this as a customer service escalate the issue back up to Waymo employees, for example, in Mountain View. So basically now, it's the remote assist is 2 layers. Some companies try to use all 3. I think one of the biggest concerns lately, though, about these remote assist centers has been at least the alleged assertion that Waymo is operating all of its contractor remote assist functions in the Philippines, so offshore. Waymo has not personally confirmed that to me, although I've heard this from multiple sources. So it would be good if Waymo wanted to address this directly. But that's a problem because that latency, remember I told you, if you're halfway around the world, we're not just talking about milliseconds latency, we're talking about seconds. And even in the case of you're just looking at a light to say whether it's red, yellow, or green, the delay in communications plus the human delay in being able to figure out what the situation is, that latency can build up and cause a crash like we know has been. So I just if there's one issue I could jump up and down and talk about is latency. The use of remote operators offshore, whether or not we're talking about remote driving or remote assist, remote operators who are also halfway around the world only make that latency situation much worse. I cannot emphasize this enough. I don't think that we need a lot of federal regulations around self-driving personally. This, however, would be the one area I do think we need some operations, because just like the Air Force, we should not have, as taxpayers, we should not have had to pay, I don't know, it's probably like $100 million to watch drone after drone after drone get crashed on landing, while people tried to figure it out. We needed to make the right decision earlier, and we had all the theory that we needed to make the Air Force, or try to advise the Air Force against that. I mean, that's a whole nother cultural issue, which I won't get into today. So I think one of the other big issues that's been raised recently is not all of these remote, so none of these remote operators that I've talked to are customer interfacing. There's a whole nother layer of customer interfacing, I would say kind of like the OnStar call group, customer service agents. So many of you have seen the videos where the Waymo is going through the Phoenix parking lot around and around, and he's trying to call somebody. This has been happening in Texas where something bad is happening, and then there's some conversation that's going back in the back seat with the passengers, and the ethereal voice that's coming from somewhere. None of those are the remote operators that I'm talking about. They're the customer service agents. And to my understanding, that at least for Waymo, they are not in the same room. They're explicitly held apart. There is some discussion about, is that the right way? Should these jobs be separate? I actually do not have I'll show you some research results that kind of speak to this. I will tell you that there's no one right answer. In some cases, I can see where it would be good to have one person be able to be customer facing and also help a car solve problems. But depending on the workload, then you might not want that, right? And so now I'm going to talk a little bit more about, well, then how would we know what is the right architecture for that? Okay. But before I do that, I wanted to talk about a couple other things. I already mentioned the federal oversight issue. The issue with federal oversight is these people are fundamentally doing the same jobs as aircraft dispatchers. They are given a lot of responsibility in a safety critical system. And so if we're going to have any kind of remote operators, whether or not it's remote driving, remote assist, whether that remote assist is done by contractors or done by company employees, the reality is, A, they all need to have driver's license, and probably commercial driver's license. And B, they all need to be drug tested, drug, alcohol. Like right now, there's just, and I'm not accusing any company of not necessarily having good work practices, but it's not required. And as self-driving cars continue to increase their footprints around the country, we're just going to have to professionalize this, right? And that's going to have to include licensing and some kind of review of training procedures. None of you would get into an aircraft if you didn't think your pilot had extensive training. So why is it that we don't think that remote operators, whether they're drivers or remote assist, should not have to have at least a minimum set of training requirements and proof that those objectives have been met, just like we do for regular dispatchers? So I do think the aviation dispatch model, it's not perfect, but it is one that will probably end up informing what happens with remote operators in years to come. I also want to briefly touch on metrics. So this is a paper that I wrote that showed, if you look at Cruise, Waymo, Zoox, who's having, these are your average drivers right here, average rideshare drivers, and this is what the accident rates look like. I just want to reiterate, even I disagree with myself about this now because of the significant use of remote operations. I just don't think that these are legitimate numbers. I think we need to quit trying to make the case for something that is not the same, and instead focus on the safety issues of, look, I want remote operators. I do not. I saw how it revolutionized military operations. These planes would be falling out of the sky if it weren't for all these humans. This is human-machine interaction at its best. So I think we should quit pushing back or trying to deny that we have remote operators or try to pretend that they're not there, instead of trying to say, okay, this is just a stopgap measure. It's not. This is what all car companies going forward are going to have remote assistance in some way. So I wish that we would move from these platforms, these adversarial platforms, and start kind of embracing it, and then realize this is actually a good thing. We're creating jobs where there weren't any before. And when people start to say AI is taking all of our jobs, this would be, I think, a huge win for everybody to say, oh, look, but there's this other area that we're creating jobs. Okay. I think this is my last slide. Oops. I don't know what's happening there. Okay.
So Missy, we are past the hour.
Oh, okay. Well, let me,
yeah,
I think
yeah.
I just have, this is a very quick, I'm glad you said that because I can't see the clock from here. Real quick. So there's like I referenced before, there's a whole body of literature about how you develop models, formulas, predictions for how you know, do I need N people to control M vehicles? I know all this because that's how I got tenure at MIT, because for 10 years, I did nothing but look at how do you control for tasks, vehicle demands, how do you control for teaming arrangements, and how do you scale? Because if you're going to operate 100 vehicles, for example, in a fleet in Austin, how do you know how many operators that you need? So I still think that these are big open questions that we don't know. I will just tease you to say there is some research out there that says you shouldn't task your people beyond what we call 70% utilization. I'm not going to go into that anymore, other than you really should go out. If you're in this area, you need to go out and avail yourself of this research, because there's a lot of really great lessons learned out of the military operations. Okay, there, see, I told you, I was almost done.
Yeah, fantastic. I hope you know kind of what people presented before you. I think you may have gone to see Carol's slides. I'm not sure about Chris's, but obviously there was a lot of crash rate discussion and proxies and that sort of thing. And we do have one question from you from Caleb, who probably lives in Florida, because he asked if you have any sense on how the Jacksonville Transit Authority will be using and operating their AV buses.
I used to live there. I don't know, you know, because, and it's interesting because I just did a national TRB committee on electric buses. So I know that very much they're coming, but I will tell you, they have no idea that how to populate a remote operations center. I brought this up to the National Academies for Electric Buses, and there's like a big question mark over everybody's head. We don't know what's happening. So I think this is a really great emerging field that still, there's so much research that's needed.
And Chris, your firm came up a lot since you were the leader here in the US. Of course, we have Apollo Go kind of as a mirror over in China with a similar fleet size and miles driven. Would you mind responding to some of the ideas that came up?
Yeah, sure. I think this is just one area that I disagree with Missy on, that the crash rates are not important. I think we do have a kind of epidemic on our roads, a road safety epidemic, and I don't think it really matters how we're doing it, but we are reducing crash rates, and so I think this should be seen as a win for traffic safety. We are replacing human ride hailing. We're competing with Uber and Lyft, and so we're reducing those rates. I'm sorry, Professor Cummings, that you missed my talk. I don't really think that ride hailing benchmark that you use is really a fair comparison. I think that data has a lot of underreporting in property damage only. So I think that's not really a fair assessment that Waymo has a equal crash rate to ride hailing. We think it's much lower.
Well, I mean, you know, that's why and by the way, I did listen to your talk. So, I mean, we're going to agree to disagree. It's just, you know, the longer we ignore the remote operation component of this, the longer it's going to take us to get to truly safer systems that protect the public. But by the way, I am in total agreement that humans are terrible drivers. There's not a day that doesn't go by in Washington, D.C. that I am desperate for these people to get off the road.
Yeah, it's just something about remote assistance. We believe at Waymo that remote assistance is an important component. I don't think we've ever said this is a stopgap or it's something that we're temporarily doing. It is very integral to our operations. I do think that there needs to be more standardization in this area, and we're leading the way in that. We're part of the AVSC, which has started work on remote assistance. I think we're in agreement actually that operations is very difficult. We have not done that in the past, and we see the same studies and science that Professor Cummings was presenting. It's just incredibly difficult to do. So we prefer to do this kind of augmentation, question answering. Augmented trajectories is maybe the most aggressive form of remote assistance we use. I do think that there is need for more research in this area, and I certainly see a lot of other companies that are saying some things that I'm not sure we would really agree with. And so I do think it's an important issue. But I do think our safety record kind of speaks for itself. We don't have a lot of incidences where remote assistance is causing crashes. If you look at our SGO crashes recently, we really don't have a lot of those resulting in crashes. We've been doing this a long time, so we have iterated on our remote assistance system. So it's not something we talk a whole lot about with the public because as the whole your whole presentation showed, it's very complicated. It's hard to get across all these different levels of remote assistance. But it is something that we take very seriously and we think is important.
My husband and I were following a Waymo down San Jacinto the other day when they erected these, it was a detour that nobody had foreseen. All these humans just driving right into it and like, oh my God, what are we going to do? Like, should we turn right or should we turn left? Because either way, it was going to be a bad decision. And the Waymo made the decision quite quickly and capably. I don't know if you guys got to put names on your Waymos because I'm not sure we were following the same Waymo when we finally got around and out of this thing. But yeah, that's my one request to Waymo is to please add names the way Cruise had cute names. And all of you can suggest some names in the chat box here. Eric, any thoughts you want to give us?
Yeah, I mean, like one point I've made a few times in the past was that, when we do these studies comparing with humans, and, that's not the ultimate measure, but it is an important milestone to hit. What we're looking at is the current operations. So for example, the study I'm doing right now with the SGO, let's take the Waymo subset of that. That's not studying the same thing as the study I published in 2017. They're different things. And I'm not as concerned about exactly what those things are. It's more like if they're doing these on public roads, how do they compare with some known quantity, whether that be humans or as they continue to improve, even arbitrarily lower benchmarks than that, crash rate benchmarks. So just remember, we're not studying self-driving cars as if it's one single thing. It's the current state of it that we study whenever we do a study.
Well, hopefully we can get the cost down. So Lyft is still costing about $2 a mile here. And Missy and others, we're doing a study with Kantaro, another graduate student of mine, to, pool the rides, fill these seats if we can, and keep it all electric and smart charge and minimize the empty vehicle miles traveled in all these ways. But to really get people pooling, there's got to be an incentive. And Chris, we're really hoping that in addition to putting cute names on the vehicles so we can identify them, letting people pool in these vehicles would be fantastic soon. I'm wondering, when will you be able to get rid of that steering wheel? Is that not coming soon to free up that fourth or fifth spot in the vehicle?
Yeah, that's still kind of an unresolved FMVSS issue in the US. So there are small exemptions available for under 1,500 vehicles to not have a steering wheel, because of course there's standards where you have to have a driver airbag in every vehicle, and so there's been a little bit of work. Some companies are getting these exemptions, but we just don't think in the coming years that's really going to meet our scale. We're already pushing those limits for the number of exemptions you can have exempt vehicles. So for the time being, our current vehicles and the ones that are upcoming will still have all the human controls.
Yeah. Well, yeah, Uber and Lyft aren't offering me shared rides very often either. So, yeah, and we love how you guys are able to, shift to Avis and Lyft in different cities. I think that's wonderful. You're really getting a sense of, contractors and keeping everybody on their toes. Missy, anything else you want to say as we let people go? I'm going to stay in the room. If whoever wants to keep chatting, this was really wonderful to hear from all of you. But Missy, any responses?
First, I want to say, Kara, when you question me on, you're like, do you have enough slides? I'm like, girl, I'm always way too long. And secondly, I would say, to the point about the FMVSS, look, Zoox just got, they played an interesting game and they just got approval for non-standard cars. So I think that there is movement afoot, and, you may not be, I think Waymos in a great position right now to get other FMVSS. I do think, I just wanted to be clear, I know it sounds like a broken record though, this remote ops piece has got to be solved, and not just standardized, but regulated. That actually is the key to having people in America trust these systems. If you can say to them, look, we have programs in place, just like we do for aviation, so that these remote dispatchers are certified and we know that they're not doing drugs and everybody has a license, like we're on top of it. I know that people hear, oh, that's too much bureaucracy, that's too much regulation. But in the end, that is what makes people believe in the safety of the system.
Yeah, it doesn't trouble me at all, except for the cost, right? We would love to see this get down to $1 per mile, or at the passenger level, maybe 50 cents per passenger mile to encourage that sharing, and of course to take over the transit systems. I think our transit operators are paying $3 per mile, or maybe that's the cost, and the rider pays about 15-20% of that. And so, immediately you could see this just changing the way we have, much more demand responsive transit in systems where the roadways aren't too congested. But Chris, we're going to let you have the final word. You're the one who helped to inspire me to have this session. So anything else before we let folks go?
No, it's been a great session. Thanks for organizing, inviting us all, and hope everybody took something away.
My pleasure. Hey, Missy, how did you hear this session if you had the wrong URL? How did you hear Chris speak?
Oh, I don't know. Maybe it just didn't show up because I got in. I heard at least the whole second half of your lecture, so maybe it just took a while for it to show my name up.
That's great. Yeah, because I didn't reply to your email till about 3:15 or no, 2:15 my time. So I think we were into Eric's or Carol's at that point where I had a moment.
Oh, well, that could be it. Because I could only hear, I couldn't see.
Yeah. So, yeah, anyhow, I will probably be writing you. And Missy, when I gave your introduction at the very beginning, I somehow skipped the MIT part. How long were you there at MIT?
A decade.
I mentioned Duke, I mentioned NHTSA, I mentioned GMU, and of course the Air Force. So, man.
Navy, but that's okay.
Oh, I think I said, yeah, I'll check my notes on that. But yeah, I'm really not a military expert. I can't keep all those titles they have consistent. And Kentaro has just connected. Kentaro, thank you so much for leading all of the tech stuff, like Lynn Sue, who we had here today. But yeah, people are going to love listening to this in the weeks and years to come. We're going to have the recordings posted in a couple weeks, everybody. And Kentaro and Lynn will be dealing with that, and they'll try to time mark each of the presenters, so it'll be easy to move around. Any questions for me, you guys? Anything? Eric, good luck with the 30 by 30. I love the graphic that comes with that. That's fantastic. You go arrow going down, arrow going forward. Missy, are you familiar with IIHS 30 by 30?
I'm sorry, you broke up there.
Oh, IHS has a 30% reduction in the US crash count or death count
It's a goal we're putting out
by
there
2030.
because
Yeah.
the problem is since 2014, fatalities have gone up 30%, and we and everyone else keep talking about zero, but we want to change the direction, at least be going in the right direction. So we're setting this goal, hoping that it'll inspire some action.
I'm 100% in support of driving these numbers down. You know, I honestly, I think if I were to make one recommendation to try to improve safety, it would be we just have to start speed control, speed controllers, and people hate it. You know, I'm like the least popular person whenever you bring that, but I think speed governors. I just don't think Americans, we're just irresponsible drivers. And, I think more is going to have to be done, but more power to you, whatever I can do to help.
Thanks. Yeah, we're big fans of intelligent speed assist, not just raw governors, because that pays attention to the speed limits as well. And the speed limits themselves is a big issue. We've been raising them since 1994 or so. And if they had remained the same, we would have saved 45,000 lives since then. So I mean, it's a big deal, just the number on the side. And enforcing it will amplify the benefit.
And when you say since 1994, you mean the 55 that Nixon had put in to save fuel?
Yeah, we used to have a national maximum speed limit of 55. If you ever saw Sammy Hagar's music video about it, it's really funny. And then that got weakened to 65 miles per hour, and then it disappeared in 1993 or 4, one of those years. Now
Yeah.
the highest speed limit is not too far from you, Kara. It's 85 miles per hour. That's a little bit high.
Yeah, but I can tell you, yeah, a lot of people want to do that. We have made our cars so safe that people inside them just don't die, man, unless they do something really wrong. But the people on the outside, and so, that's why Chris has me focusing with Kaya on vulnerable road users, because that is just, that shouldn't happen. And so,
They'll still die if they go fast enough.
oh yeah, they do. I mean, we're only 20%. So 80% of people are, I guess there's like maybe a 5% motorcycle share. So maybe people inside of vehicles are 75%, but maybe half of those are unbelted, right?
About half of the vehicle occupants are unbelted. Motorcyclists are 15% of fatalities.
Oh, 15. Yeah, so they're almost
15. Yeah,
5%.
they've been at a record high for 4 years in a row. So yeah, we need to do something there, definitely.
So yeah, it's really hard to kill someone who is belted and, driving on the right side of the road.
At a reasonable speed.
Not too much above the post speed limit. But I do have a special website that we found that is going to help us report our own observations of horrific drivers and just push it directly to authorities. And if anybody knows the jurisdictions within the states, I would love to see that, because I think the website can only push to the DOTs right now, and to let them know, to just compile evidence on those terrible drivers that we know are out there, using common cameras that everybody has, because, half the states won't allow automated speed or red light enforcement, anything like that. Okay. Cool. So I put the NCHRP report in there. Yeah, definitely pushing for speed governors. It's just embarrassing that wasn't like original manufacturer equipment 100 years ago. You can add it right now. Missy, do you know how much it costs, or Chris, to add, or Eric actually, to add a speed governor to like my Tesla 3 that would mimic the posted speed limit? Is that like $1,000?
Zero cost. I mean, it's only software coding cost. There's no, I mean, if it's software, which is what that is, you don't actually need a governor.
Okay, so my Tesla allows me to govern the top speed, and it'll beep at me when I set it to a speed above the post speed limit. But so you think that just based on its maps, which appear to be very accurate here in Austin for the posted speed limits, like within 10 feet of a speed limit sign change, it's got it. Now I know the latency and parallel roads, it could like bring me to a slow speed when I'm alongside a frontage road, but Yeah, so what about an older vehicle like a Prius Gen 4 from 10 years ago?
I think
Numbers are
adding,
not, go ahead.
sorry, I was going to say, I think adding a device like that would limit the speed to the speed limit is probably a little bit unrealistic at a large population level. But there are systems that will read the speed limit signs and warn you if you're over the limit. And those can be very helpful to drivers, especially when they don't intend to go super fast.
Yeah, I was gonna say speed governors are, I mean, they're maybe $1, you know, especially if you bought them in bulk, but it's the labor cost of doing the retrofitting on cars and then the test and evaluation to make sure, you know, so that would just be unacceptable in cost. But because new cars are all mostly digitally operated, I mean, this is one of those things where it's, I think, going forward with technology where it is today, it's easy, and it would be, you know, trivial to do.
Great. Well, I may be writing you, Missy. I'm supposed to head to MIT soon. I'll be a mobility fellow, or this year I have been, so I have to write a report on this topic. And yeah, I haven't found too many people willing to give cost estimates by make and model, especially. So anything else? You guys, you've been great. Thanks so much for working with me over the past month or two to get this together.
Yeah, thanks for the invite.
You're welcome.
Get some rest, you guys. See you. Bye, Caleb. Bye, Stephen.
Bye, everyone.